The Last Day of Atlantis. Planet Earth is nearly 5 billion years old, 3 times younger than the planet Umaran, which is 15 billion years old. Earth completes one revolution around its star, the Sun, in 365 days, with a day lasting 24 hours. Umaran orbits its star in 1,100 days, a Umaran year, and its day lasts 30 hours. The Sun warms the Earth unevenly. Scorching heat prevails at the equator and its vicinity, while at the North and South poles, the sunbeams hit at an angle, providing little warmth, leaving these regions covered in perpetual snow and ice. For long months, the polar regions and the poles are shrouded in pitch-black, freezing darkness. Umaran lacks such polar regions. This is due to the fact that, in addition to the primary sun, whose zenith follows the equator, Umaran is warmed by 2 smaller suns, one above each pole. Though they are of relatively low power, they are sufficient to keep the temperatures at Umaran's poles between -20 degrees Celsius and +5 degrees Celsius, depending on the season. Consequently, Umaran does not develop the massive caps of eternal ice and snow found on Earth. Nearly 80 million years ago, Earth's rotation had reached a constant speed, completing a full turn in 24 hours. Earth's mass had settled and its orbit was stable. The Earth had reached astronomical maturity. Stability had also been achieved throughout the solar system and the Milky Way galaxy. Yet the sun's rays fell at an angle over the poles. The globe warmed unevenly. The equator scorched, while the poles, buried for months in polar night, cracked with frost. Snow fell at the poles and settled, gradually turning into ice. This continued for millions of years. The ice caps at the poles grew thicker, their reach wider. The volume and weight of this massive ice shield increased incessantly until it finally reached a critical limit. Driven by the pressure of the ice masses, the centrifugal force of Earth's own rotation, and the conjunction of 5 planets, Neptune, Uranus, Venus, Mercury, and Mars, lining up on one side of the Sun against the Earth on the other. The 45-kilometer-thick Earth's crust shifted over its glowing, fluid internal mass. The so-called falling of the poles to the equator occurred. The continents relocated. Temperate and subtropical regions rose over the poles, while the poles fell to lower latitudes. This crustal shift, occurring at catastrophic speed, brought global floods, the rapid melting of vast ice masses, and the simultaneous freezing of former temperate and subtropical zones that moved into the polar regions. This was accompanied by horrific earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and giant forest fires. Wildlife was on the brink of extinction. The Earth's fauna and humanity almost entirely perished. Slowly, the Earth calmed. The surviving flora and fauna, including humanity, began to adapt. Some species lost the struggle for existence and died out. Others adapted. Still others found more favorable conditions in the New World and flourished. After the crustal shift, the way of life for the surviving peoples changed fundamentally. Many fell into ruin, while others were carried by the crustal movement to southern lands, even more favorable for development. Though many died in the earthquakes and floods, and entire cities were wiped from the map, the survivors retained their culture, skills, and knowledge. In these new southern lands, culture, science, industry, trade, and finance began to thrive. Great changes occurred in statehood and social organization. Many legends and beliefs have survived from these events, containing lessons for future generations. But has humanity on Earth learned from them? The behavior of previous civilizations shows they have not. The attitude toward nature and mineral resources has remained the same across every civilization: extract and consume, without a thought for the consequences or the future. Even though man understands that resources are non-renewable. However, it must be noted that in considering coal, oil, gas, and many other minerals to be non-renewable, humanity is mistaken. The shifting of the crust relocates continents and oceans, Vast forests perish, mountains are cast onto plains or into the ocean, exposing their interiors. The sediments of oceans and seas end up in the mountains, yet nothing disappears without a trace. Buried forests slowly turn into coal, oil, and gas. Sea sediments, cast onto plains, become available to mankind. Overturned mountains reveal gold deposits, iron or copper ores. The processes within the earth continue, producing additional resources. Resources that humanity, in its inability to look back through time, considers non-renewable, actually do renew, continuing the cycle of nature, just as everything eventually becomes dust and then turns living again. The problem is that man on Earth uses resources so wastefully and thoughtlessly, as if crustal shifts occurred every other day, constantly providing new deposits. By over-consuming, man may outpace the Earth's regeneration. He may be left empty-handed, waiting for nature's mercy, and when it finally arrives, there may be no one left to receive it. The 45-kilometer-thick mass of the crust had turned over its interior, sliding along the plastic layer of the asthenosphere. This shift set all the Earth's continents in motion like a giant carousel. Oceans, seas, and lakes swapped places. Rivers changed course, many disappearing entirely while new ones formed. From Africa, all names used according to modern Earth geography, and southern Europe, a massive chunk of land broke away and moved west, forming the American continent, South and North America with Canada. Between Africa and the new continent, America, a vast body of water appeared, the Atlantic Ocean. As a result of the crustal shift, the continent of Atlantis, which had been located between Iceland and the British Isles, was carried south, coming to rest in the region that currently includes the Cape Verde Islands, the Azores, the Canaries, and Madeira. Africa was still connected to Europe. The Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea only formed during the second crustal shift. The tidal waves, earthquakes, and eruptions triggered by the shift claimed tens of thousands of Atlantean lives. Vast numbers of domestic and wild animals perished, crops were destroyed, and cities lay in ruins. Ash clouds covered the sky, hiding the sun and causing the remaining crops to fail. Famine and plague struck, killing tens of thousands more. But thanks to the mountainous terrain, which offered refuge from the raging waters, the majority of the Atlantean people survived. Slowly the earth calmed, the waters receded, the sky cleared, and the inhabitants of Atlantis found themselves miraculously in wonderful new conditions. A warm, humid maritime climate, sun shining for days on end throughout the year, occasional refreshing rain showers, and breathtakingly beautiful nights with ink-black skies and large, brilliant stars. The priests of Atlantis explained this miracle as an expression of divine will, a blessing from the Almighty, who had preserved their state, culture, and people, who had heard their prayers when they turned to their God in horror. The people of Atlantis began to consider themselves a God-chosen people. The population adapted to its new location, which offered significantly better living conditions than their previous high-latitude home. Fields yielded 2 harvests a year, lush grasslands fed the livestock. The warm ocean surrounding the continent provided a rich catch of fish, in which the Atlanteans were great masters. Atlantis lived and developed in abundance and contentment. Yet, they did not forget the horrors they had survived. These were passed down as legends, reflected in literature, religious rites, and prayers. After the catastrophe, their faith deepened. To conduct their cults and thank their god, they built massive temples and churches with high towers. Though they were skilled metalworkers, they used only stone for their temples, understanding that stone is more eternal than metal. The bountiful nature allowed an increasing number of Atlanteans to be freed from common physical labor and dedicate themselves to intellectual pursuits, the fine arts, scientific research, and everything related to culture and education. Special attention was paid to mathematics and astronomy. The Atlanteans knew the concept of zero and the positional numeral system, which even later civilizations, such as ancient Rome, did not possess. Atlantis had already developed as a unified people with hallmarks of statehood: the collection of state taxes, the obligation of public works, and the election of local government bodies. The state was ruled by a monarch whose position was passed down through inheritance or by the ruler appointing a successor. During the relocation of Atlantis, the Titan Atlas ruled. The monarch appointed high state officials as well as viceroys in the provinces. The Atlantean population was divided into several loosely defined classes, with the exception of slaves, whose status was strictly demarcated and lifelong. Slaves were the inhabitants of conquered lands, those who had resisted the Atlantean colonizers. Thus, in the modern sense, the slaves were the forced laborers and political prisoners of Atlantis. Due to the extensive colonization of land and the associated uprisings, the number of slaves in Atlantis grew constantly. There were nearly as many slaves as there were Atlanteans. They were sold like mere merchandise. Bulk buyers were given discounts, price reductions, or buy 3, get 1 free deals. As the colonial territories expanded, the price of slaves fell. Value was only placed on slaves who possessed skills in smelting iron, building ships, or constructing buildings. Glass blowers, musicians, and the literate were also prized. The slaves formed a separate society and were divided into estates. The slave society was like a state within a state. Physical labor was left entirely to the slaves, performed only by those of the lowest rank. They lived in the harshest conditions, on the level of animals. They were fed food scraps and overripe or spoiled fruit. The resulting gastrointestinal diseases led to high mortality, but this did not worry the Atlanteans. Slaves were in abundance. Dead slaves were thrown from a specifically designated cliff into the sea, where sharks circled in constant anticipation of a meal. Little attention was paid to the clothing of the lower-rank slaves. Their garment was a sack-like tunic with holes for the head and arms. Slaves wore no shoes. That would have been an unnecessary expense for their owners. Any Atlantean could keep hundreds or thousands of slaves around them as their wealth allowed. Often there was a separate slave for every minor movement of the master. A child born of a union between a slave and an Atlantean was recognized as an Atlantean, possessing all the rights and duties thereof. Referencing their origin was forbidden under threat of severe punishment. If the mother was a slave and the father an Atlantean, the child was raised by Atlanteans. However, if the mother was an Atlantean and the father a slave, the father had no rights or obligations toward the child. Atlanteans encouraged the birth of such illegitimate children. It promoted the growth of the population, which was crucial for the continuous expansion of the colonial empire. As mentioned, classes in Atlantis were not strictly defined. Transition from a lower class to a higher one was free, without restrictions, depending on a person's own abilities. The population could be roughly divided into state officials, workers, large landowners, small landowners, merchants, industrialists, and representatives of other professions: doctors, artists, lawyers, scientists, teachers, and priests. The skilled workers of Atlantis operated in their workshops, assisted by wage laborers and slaves. With the expansion of seafaring and trade, there was a constant demand for products to be exchanged for goods available in other lands: copper, gold, silver, tea, spices, cotton, silk, and furs. Everything that did not grow or was not produced on the continent was imported to Atlantis. Furthermore, everything imported was dirt cheap. It was profitably exchanged for Atlantean exports, and as a rule, the barter was done through deception, as other peoples did not know the true value or the equivalent of the goods being offered in exchange. Later, trade was conducted using money, which offered even greater opportunities for fraud, as only the Atlanteans knew the true value, or worthlessness, of the currency. The expansion of colonial regions and the ever-growing customer base constantly increased the wealth of Atlantis. In other lands, manufacturing was suppressed under various pretexts, turning those countries into mere sources of raw materials, and their people into consumers of Atlantean-made goods. Even when local production was organized, the factory owners were still Atlanteans. The vast import-export business was handled by a large merchant class. Business was conducted with anything that could be foisted upon the conquered peoples. Advertising was used extensively, aimed more at human stupidity than at intelligence. A merchant in Atlantis was judged not by his honesty, but by the scale of his cunning and the size of his profit. Cheating other nations was considered a matter of honor, and accordingly, respect for the merchant grew and his position in society rose. Having established trade links with vast areas, the Atlantean merchants devised a clever trick to swindle raw materials out of undeveloped countries without giving goods or money in return. For this, they began issuing promissory notes, bonds, promising to bring the goods during the next visit. On the next trip, however, the Atlantean merchants offered completely different goods, and the local businessmen, unable to link the value of the bonds and the price relationships of different goods, soon found themselves in a labyrinth of debt from which only the Atlanteans knew how to emerge and profit. The skill of manipulating money, bonds, and various goods and their price differences served the Atlanteans well later when they began to carry out their plans for world domination. Pedagogues, lawyers, medics, and expert consultants in various fields were particularly prized in Atlantis. This was due to the rapid population growth and rising influence of Atlantis among other nations. Famous pedagogues lived well, teaching mostly the offspring of high society. In pedagogy, great attention was paid to deepening the belief in the chosenness of Atlantis and its people in the growing generation, and raising them to be cosmopolitans. The main subjects were the languages and cultures of many nations and the acquisition of trade and business knowledge, but mathematics and astronomy were paramount. In higher schools, they studied law, medicine, and logic. Special training was given to the so-called court speakers. The one who defended the accused was called an advocate, while the one who presented the charges was the prosecutor. Both required knowledge of rhetoric and a lack of conscience. Often, advocates and prosecutors used the help of a pragmatic or jurist who knew the laws and recognized only the letter of the law without descending into discussions about its spirit. Advocates received massive fees if they succeeded in talking their client free. However, the lion's share of this fee had to be given to the jurist pragmatic, as mere flowery speech alone would not win a case. Military personnel formed a special class of state officials. Their uniforms were adorned with gold and silver stars, triangles, and crosses shimmering in the sun, symbols of power and loyalty. Soldiers received valuable gifts and high pay from the rulers, ensuring their loyalty. To raise their status even further, they were given the right to judge. They were often bribable, colluding with advocates or prosecutors, sometimes both, and taking payment in advance. They intentionally dragged out proceedings and demanded proof of circumstances that were impossible to prove and had nothing to do with the case. Colluding with an advocate, a judge might allow special hand-clappers, claqueurs, into the courtroom, who supported the advocate's flowery phrases with noise and shouting, giving the defendant the impression of the advocate's great wisdom. The prosecutor often brought his own gang of claqueurs. Such trials usually ended in a brawl between the claqueurs, from which only the advocate, the prosecutor, and the judge emerged as victors, having succeeded in postponing the case indefinitely. Throughout the delay, the parties were forced to bring valuable gifts to their representatives, while the judge continued to draw his state-sanctioned salary. Atlantis had developed agriculture, ironworking, stoneworking, architecture, seafaring, trade, industry, and fishing. Agriculture, alongside usury, was one of the most profitable activities, including the wine industry, tobacco cultivation, and brewing. Even greater profit came from seafaring and trade, despite the high risks. These risks came not only from the forces of nature. Piracy was widespread. Significant expenses in this field included so-called legalized bribes paid to local rulers for the exclusive right to import or export certain goods. Science was at a high level, especially mathematics and astronomy, which aided seafaring, which in turn developed astronomy and geographical knowledge. The state's policy was directed toward colonizing other lands. Atlantis sent numerous colonists and missionaries to all parts of the world. Great importance was placed on colonial expansion. Atlantis had established ties with its closest neighbors, Egypt, West Africa, and Europe, as well as distant continents, South and North America, Asia, and the whole of Africa. Everywhere the Atlantean colonists and priests arrived, they found peoples and societies at a significantly lower level of development. Many previously existing states were on the verge of extinction following the cataclysm, having regressed into primitive social orders. The same natural disaster that brought prosperity to Atlantis brought destruction, death, misery, and cultural regression to most of the world's peoples. Even though millennia had passed since the cataclysm, many cultures still could not recover. Seeing the misery of others reinforced the Atlanteans' belief in their own uniqueness, that they were the chosen people of God. Atlantis decided to colonize the whole world, to set out to conquer the globe. However, Atlantis lacked the physical strength, more specifically, enough of its own people for a full physical conquest. The physical presence of Atlantean officials and viceroys in all inhabited regions was impossible. Finding deputies and executors for their plans among other nations was also impossible, as they were incomparably lower in their development. Furthermore, the religions of local peoples were inferior to the Atlantean religion. While the Atlantean religion was based on faith in an incorporeal spiritual universal being, God, who has power over all, other religions were still based on mythological beliefs, the worship of fire, water, celestial bodies, lightning, the sun, and other earthly and heavenly phenomena. A massive spiritual chasm existed. It is well known, however, that a higher religion, ideology, or philosophy conquers the lower. To implement their plans for world conquest, Atlantis decided to use primarily spiritual, ideological, and religious colonization. The rulers and priests of Atlantis understood that despite human development, a person gravitates toward evil of their own accord, driven by internal, nature-given emotions. However, a person must be forced toward the good. Since the days when humans acted as animal herds, they submitted to raw, violent power. As human society developed, they were forced to obey laws, initially by violence, later by the fear of punishment. Human behavior on Earth had shown, wherever the sense of the inevitability of punishment disappears, respect for the law also vanishes, and crime grows. In the herd society, punishment was inevitable, and crime was unknown. Just as in the animal herd of early human society, the stronger was always right. Power always belongs to those who possess it, as power is applied by the strong against the weak. This stems from the laws of nature. But as long as power exists, there will always be those who wish to seize it. The drive for power is so strong that it is difficult to find a person of sound mind who would not be willing to sacrifice the interests of society to establish their own power. The Atlantean rulers decided to exploit these characteristic human drives to implement their plans for world domination. They began to cultivate ideas of freedom among the peoples of other continents. They were given the chance to free themselves, only from the power of their own rulers. Since human society, like an animal herd, cannot exist without power, the only option for the freedom seekers was to fall, or rather voluntarily submit themselves to the power of Atlantis. The rules of Atlantean operation in governing other peoples were cunning, hypocrisy, duplicity, bribery, deception, and betrayal. The motto of their behavior formed a symbolic snake. It looked as if it were coiled and ready to bite its own tail, but in reality it was ready to strangle anyone who fell into its grip. The goal of the Atlanteans was to destroy the cultural heritage of other nations and consign it to oblivion. In its place, they offered a culture that awakened the most primitive feelings: aggression, violence, sadism, betrayal, pornography, and killing. Honesty and decency were made a laughingstock. Rudeness and insolence, lies and deceit, drunkenness and drug addiction, animalistic fear of one another, nationalism and ethnic hatred, all of this was instilled by the Atlantean colonizers skillfully, covertly, and constantly. Moreover, these were presented as the high cultural achievements of Atlantis. The sages of Atlantis raised the art of governing the masses and individuals to a scientific level, using cleverly constructed false teachings, false theories, and phraseology. Local rulers were given bad advice, resulting in laws and regulations that sowed confusion and enmity among the people. Following the advice of Atlantean instructors and teachers, personal and national interests were pitted against each other, as were religious, ethnic, and cultural beliefs, sowing anxiety, strife, and hatred throughout the world. While Atlantis itself played the role of the apparent peacemaker. This role of mediator instilled respect for Atlantis in all colonial nations, seeing it as a necessary force, a benefactor, and the savior of the human race. The Atlanteans exploited all the deficiencies of other people's minds, which they considered to be honesty, directness, helpfulness, and a love of work. Particular attention was paid to the character traits and customs of each nation, so that by re-educating them, creating a new man, so to speak, the desired results could be achieved. They acted slowly and carefully, adding more and more nations to the Atlantean sphere of influence. Among some peoples, anti-Atlantean sentiment had to be artificially generated, only to be exploited for their own interests. Atlantean teachers, advisors, and priests interfered in the administration of justice, election procedures, personal freedom, education, religious cults, and upbringing both within and outside the family. They interfered everywhere there was an opportunity to influence people's decisions, behavior, and preferences. While seemingly offering something positive, they raised people in the spirit of accepting everything negative. The goal was to throw everything into confusion, to turn it all upside down, only to then step before the people and say, "We have found the way out." The Atlanteans replaced the kings of local peoples with constitutional monarchs, and then with elected presidents, who became personality-less puppets in the hands of Atlantean advisors. Particularly suitable candidates for the presidency were individuals whose past contained some dark, suspicious story unclear to the people, who constantly carried their own bucket scandal that they had stepped into either through carelessness, intent, or circumstances. Such a local president was always in the grip of the Atlanteans, being obedient and fearful. Even if the parliament wanted to shake the president, they would not succeed, as the laws constructed with the help of Atlantean advisors allowed the president to leave laws passed by Parliament unpromulgated. Laws formulated by the sages of Atlantis provided the opportunity to appeal to the people, the blind mass. With clever advertising, which relied more on human stupidity than intelligence, they were able to carry out all necessary referendums in the desired direction. At the suggestion of Atlantean advisors, most government decisions were classified under the pretext of maintaining state secrets, and parliamentary inquiries to the government were abolished under the same pretext. One of the most important Atlantean undertakings was the mixing of relations between peoples, states, and governments, creating lasting contradictions, quarrels, clashes, and hatred between nations. Atlantis, having scattered a large part of its people across the globe as advisors and teachers, achieved an influence that no conqueror using physical violence could have managed. The sages of Atlantis established an equivalent of power, which became money. Initially, gold and gold coins were used, but soon money replaced them, and in the plans for world conquest, paper money acquired particularly great significance. The limitless possibilities of money and financial operations were, alongside spiritual conquest, the second crucial factor for achieving Atlantean supremacy. Money was released into circulation, and then fully concentrated in Atlantean hands, leaving other nations with only the bare minimum to cover daily needs. Artificial money shortages and surpluses were created, throwing nations into the madness of inflation, which ate away their savings and gave Atlanteans the chance to act as puppeteers, directing cash flows as they saw fit. The world's bankers, money changers, and speculators, all these characters were representatives of Atlantis, in whose power it was to cause bankruptcies and financial catastrophes, who gave bribes to political parties and state officials, demanding necessary favors in return. Money knew no barriers. Money had no nationality, or rather, money had only one nationality: Atlantis. In the name of money, nations and states were set against each other and wars were started. If there were no other reasons for war, then racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural differences were exploited. To create even greater opportunities for financial speculation and fraud, the Atlanteans established a securities market. This market was entirely under Atlantean control. Only they knew the true value of specific securities at any given moment. Atlantis prepared economic crises by tightening the supply of money and securities and then flooding the market again. This caused spasms in national financial systems, forcing countries to take out unfavorable loans. A key condition for these loans was the precise fulfillment of Atlantean instructions and demands. Confusion was sown in national annual budgets, forcing them to adopt supplementary budgets every 3 months. Eventually, the budget lost all meaning, and the state faced bankruptcy. Again, it was Atlantis that provided effective but self-serving aid to bankrupt countries in the form of loans. The whole world groaned under the weight of mutual debt, interest, and late fees. Again and again, the empty hands of needy states stretched toward Atlantis, begging for money. Slowly, but seemingly voluntarily, all states were tilted under the power of Atlantis. For this, no physical violence or armed conquest was necessary. The spiritual annexation and the manipulation of money were enough. The question arises, why did Atlantis need to conquer other nations and bring them under its influence and control? What was the goal of world conquest? Was it only wealth, to achieve a prosperous, carefree life for the Atlantean people? No, that was far from the main reason, though Atlantis loved to live in splendor and abundance, to enjoy a life that is not eternal. The eternal life and death of the individual were not primary questions in Atlantean philosophy. Atlantis worried about a significantly more serious problem. All signs indicated that another cataclysm was coming, a crustal shift, and the associated floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. Atlantis worried about the eternal life of its people as a whole. It was interested in the prosperity and continuity of the state and the people for all eternity. Atlantean scientists had concluded that the next shift of the Earth could cast Atlantis even further south and bury it forever in the ocean depths. Their research showed that after the relocation during the previous crustal shift, Atlantis had ended up in a geologically critical area that facilitated crustal sliding, earthquakes, and eruptions. The continent, state, and people of Atlantis lived in constant mortal danger, as it was unknown whether the cataclysm would occur today, tomorrow, or in hundreds or thousands of years. But they were convinced of the arrival of the last day, the apocalypse. This was also shown by their extremely thorough and complex mathematical and astronomical calculations. At the same time, they could not calculate the exact date of the cataclysm's arrival. Based on this, the state of Atlantis decided to do everything in its power to save the continent, state, and people from the approaching danger. The goal was to stop the further freezing of the Earth's poles, as well as their melting, which occurred periodically due to extensive climate warming caused by human activity. It was decided to stabilize the Earth, to keep it in balance, accounting for all factors, including the conjunction of the 5 planets that periodically align against the Earth on the other side of the Sun and affect Earth's gravity. The need for stabilization also arose from the great danger posed by the so-called Great Cross. I will briefly describe the essence of the Great Cross and its effect on the Earth. As is known, Planets move in fixed orbits, which can be at various angles to each other and intersect periodically. At these intersections, situations can occur where two or more planets meet at a single point. The result is a collision, which can cause a smaller planet to fall into a larger one or shatter both into thousands of pieces. Asteroids. At the same time, planets moving in their orbits can create situations where they align or form various shapes, star configurations. For example, as a result of periodically occurring cosmic processes lasting tens of thousands of years, the Sun, Moon, Earth, Uranus, and Neptune can line up in a single row. At a 90-degree angle to them, Jupiter and Saturn align on one side and Mars on the other. Such a planetary alignment is called the Great Cross. This special arrangement of the planets closest to Earth exerts a strong gravitational influence on the Earth and can trigger a shift in the Earth's axis. A shift in the axis would create massive oceanic waves, tsunamis, that would roll over the shores and bury all coastal cities and low-lying areas. Additionally, massive earthquakes and eruptions would occur as the crust moves to find a new balanced position relative to the Earth's axis. Furthermore, the Great Cross causes changes in the orbits of comets circling the Sun and asteroids circling between Mars and Jupiter, so that they intersect Earth's orbit and collide with it. Such collisions could destroy all life on Earth, as the atmospheric pollution from the explosions would completely shroud the sky. The globe would be buried in pitch-black, freezing darkness. To keep the Earth, especially the crust, in balance, and to regulate that balance by increasing or decreasing the ice masses at the poles, it was necessary to build dams to regulate the movement of water flows and currents toward the poles and back. It was necessary to change the course of rivers, create additional rivers, irrigate areas in one place and drain them in another. The shaping of the Earth's climate had to be taken fully under the control of the Atlantean people to regulate precipitation at the poles and thereby the thickness and weight of the ice masses. The Atlanteans saw the opportunity to reach their goal only through world conquest. By achieving world domination through spiritual and financial annexation, they hoped to put the world's nations to work for a common goal: the regulation of the Earth's climate by man, to prevent destruction and cataclysm. But they were mistaken. Although in the universe, the world, and nature, freedom is unknown. Everything in this world is interdependent, both living and non-living nature, as well as celestial bodies. Only man, ignoring the laws of nature, carries the idea of freedom and cannot give it up even under the threat of death. Atlantis achieved world domination through spiritual annexation and the power of money. But this did not go unnoticed by the peoples of the earth. They felt conquered and humiliated. Disorder and helplessness reigned in the thoughts and feelings of the nations. A people without self-respect, helpless and humiliated, was not capable of acting for a common great goal, for the benefit of the whole world, for its salvation. The Atlanteans, being practical people of action, good mathematicians and astronomers, were at the same time poor philosophers. They could not understand or recognize the finer strings of the human soul, whose chime differs greatly from the clink of money, and for which money is not enough to make them ring. Atlantean efforts to direct nations toward common action bore little fruit. The disorder and contempt for goodness cultivated for the sake of world conquest had taken root too deeply and began to produce results opposite to what was desired. And though some progress had been made in building dams and diverting currents and rivers, it was far from enough to regulate the climate on Earth. Catastrophic changes were occurring in the ice masses of Earth's south and north poles. At any moment, the Earth could lose its balance and trigger another cataclysm. The Atlanteans constantly performed astronomical observations and mathematical calculations to determine the hour of judgment, the next crustal shift. They had little hope of getting the Earth's climate under their control before the next cataclysm, the arrival of which they could already predict with thousand-year precision. This meant that the next great flood could arrive today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, or in 1,000 years. The Atlanteans understood. Having almost achieved world domination, they had not moved closer to their main goal, but had moved further away from it. They realized that only peoples whose idea of freedom is not suppressed, who are not oppressed by their own rulers or foreign conquerors, are capable of great deeds that benefit the whole world. The Atlanteans desperately continued their efforts to get the Earth's climate under control. Everything ended abruptly. The Earth shuddered, the water barriers in the Akopana Pyramid burst, and the water flows were unleashed, signaling the arrival of the great catastrophe. Volcanoes began their activity. Darkness fell over the Earth. In Egypt, on the Giza Plateau, the faithful, slumbering guard dog, the Sphinx, suddenly lifted its snout as if about to spring to its feet. But at that moment, raging waters washed over it. The construction of the sun gates in Mexico was left unfinished so suddenly as if the ladder had been kicked out from under the builder's feet. The Earth's crust turned once again over its fluid, glowing interior. At 6 in the morning, the drumbeat sounded. The signal to wake was given to the slaves, the iron smelters. Though it had been this way for almost 5 years, the drumbeat still sounded oppressive and heavy. Waking in the dim barracks, sweltering from tropical heat and the pungent smell of sweat, it seemed to Cesar as if he were being dragged from the dead, from eternal peace and bliss, back into this heavy and unjust world. But he had to rise immediately. Already the crack of the overseer's braided oxhide whip could be heard on the sweat-drenched backs of the latecomers. Cesar sat up on his reed mat, staring with dull apathy at the human shadows, whose chaotic movement was doubled by the long shadows cast by smoking torches. It felt as if he had entered the vestibule of hell. Any moment now, the gates would open. Waking today was particularly hard for Cesar, whether it was the beginning of tropical fever, exhaustion, or the mental strain he had been unable to escape or grow used to during his long years of slavery in Atlantis. Today's waking was accompanied not by the usual angst of a prisoner, but by a premonition of some great and terrible disaster. Cesar's thoughts were interrupted by the overseer's screeching command to exit the barracks, accompanied by lashings and swearing. The slaves headed for a large platform built on a cliff edge over the sea, the universal latrine, to relieve themselves before breakfast. This outdoor latrine was multi-purpose. Here, one could relieve oneself. From here, all sorts of junk, old rubbish, and other worn-out, unusable items were thrown down, including dead or severely ill slaves. Cesar stood at the edge of the platform, holding onto a crossbar so as not to fall from the cliff into the sea in his sleepy state. Though how many times the temptation had arisen, let go of the hands, feel freedom for the last time. The freedom of falling hundreds of meters down into the sea, falling and no one to stop, forbid, or command. But the will to live always won. The hands did not open. Every morning, the sun rising from behind the horizon sent a yellow-red light into the dawn sky, which, as it expanded, painted parts of the sky blood red, extinguishing the stars. Among the first, the constellation of Aquarius, hanging over the sunrise. Cesar had always admired this constellation, standing on the large, round edge of the cliff facing the sunrise. It was like a morning meeting with a friend who was always there and never betrays you, regardless of your slave status and pathetic situation. The friend greeted him first, every morning, kindly and encouragingly. Today, however, though the wake-up had occurred at exactly the same time as always, and the exit from the barracks had not been delayed by a minute, the Aquarius constellation was no longer visible. The sun had already poked its blazing edge over the horizon and extinguished all the stars. This made Cesar look in wonder for his old friend Aquarius in the eastern sky, but his eyes caught only the bluish-gray morning sky. The stars were out, and the area was unusually bright for this early hour. It seemed as if the Earth had accelerated its rotation, rushing toward the rising sun. The sting of Overseer Cremon's whip on Cesar's back made him flinch and brought him back to reality. Breakfast followed, no different from feeding animals. From a large vat, a slop was poured into long troughs, a mixture of Atlantean food scraps and spoiled fruit. Slaves shoveled the food into their mouths with their hands. Some were driven to vomit right there, as their weakened bodies and ulcerated stomachs could not take the spoiled fruit. Anyone who remained unconscious at the dining table was thrown over the cliff. The crack of Cremon's whip on the back of Cesar's neighbor signaled everyone to finish eating, line up, and head for the iron ore mine a few miles away. Cremon's own captivity had lasted nearly 12 years. He had served as an overseer for 5. He was not the cruelest. He cracked his whip not with malice, but as a form of communication, a signal for the next actions, which were known to everyone, but whose timing was marked by the whip landing on one slave or another. Since a slave's day contained very few different actions, Cremon's whip could often rest. This could not be said for other overseers, who had recently been promoted from the lowest rank. They emphasized their superiority in every way and abused their office, gaining satisfaction from it and earning the approval of their superiors, the senior slave overseers. Atlantis had created an ingenious system of slave governance, a slave social organization. 2 separate societies existed in Atlantis, that of the slaves and that of the Atlanteans. The contact points between these societies were minimal. Only the highest-ranking slaves interacted with Atlanteans. Since the slaves formed a vast mass, overseers of every stripe were numerous. In the slave society, there were slave masters, slave foremen, slave directors, slave mayors, slave governors, slave ministers, a slave prime minister, and a slave president. Additionally, a vast number of larger or smaller slave bosses existed between these officials. The slave society had its own judges, prosecutors, and advocates. The Atlanteans did not interfere in their activities. The important thing was to strictly and unswervingly follow the mindless abundance of instructions, regulations, norms, commands, prohibitions, permits, licenses, quotas, and other requirements coming from the Atlantean rulers regarding the smallest aspects of slave life. The solution was ingenious, and thanks to this social organization and the experience gained in governing slaves, the Atlanteans very successfully carried out the colonization and annexation of other nations for the purpose of world domination. Slaves were made, just as in a free society, to act for the sake of governance, power, and benefits. Remaining at the first level meant hard labor, inhuman living conditions, humiliation, beatings, and rapid death. The next level, that of the overseer, gave a small but real power, the chance to grab a larger mouthful from the subordinate's food trough, and occasionally doze in a shady spot during work hours. Within the slaves lived a constant desire to move forward in their slave life, higher and higher, which brought a better slave life, better food, better clothes, more power, and a higher social slave position. Getting ahead in life, with its accompanying benefits, this was the goal every slave strived for. For this, they used all the methods found in a normal, free Atlantean society: denunciations, bribes, violence, fawning, deceit, threats, and terror. The state within a state functioned successfully and without friction. It gave Atlanteans the chance to free themselves from the tedious and despicable activity of dealing with slaves. The labor of slaves brought profit and increased the power of the Atlantean state. Apparently, it is every ruler's dream to create a society that functions independently, without state aid or interference, while creating benefits for the rulers and opportunities to carry out their ambitious plans. When these plans fail, they blame opposing parties, unforeseen circumstances, force majeure, or the stupidity of the people. For though rulers emphasize their high responsibility at every opportunity, they bear no responsibility. Having reached the carousel of rulers, a person flies in circles, up and down, but never falls off, for the bonds of mutual accountability are tied tight. Overseer Kremen trudged behind the column of slaves, signaling with his whip to quicken the pace as the sun scorched ever more fiercely. It seemed to Kremen as if he were late to work with his herd of slaves today. The sun was inexplicably high, even though the wake-up had been given at the correct time and the morning chores had taken no longer than usual. Senior Overseer Zoilos rushed over, struck Kremen with his whip, and ordered them to start jogging. For some reason, all the slave columns were late to their workplaces in the ore mine today. Zoilos hurried the columns along, threatening to fire all the overseers and swearing profusely. Having entered the mine gates with the columns, the senior overseer cast a glance at the sundial and could not believe his eyes. The clock already showed midday. It was incomprehensible to him how the few-mile journey could have taken the columns all morning. With a heavy heart, Zoilos walked toward the slave foreman Lepidos. He was afraid. The columns arrived late, and it could cost him his position. But this time, Zoilos was lucky. Lepidos had spent a stormy night, tasting palm wine in his foreman's hut and enjoying the charms of a young slave girl who, unabashed by Zoilos, still lay on a mattress in the corner, her coal-black eyes flashing insolently. Pouring a glass of palm wine for Zoilos, and not forgetting himself, Lepidos gave general orders, showing not the slightest interest in the work. He did not know that the sun was already past midday. The hut had no windows. Only a small beam of light penetrated through the palm branches covering the door slit, cutting the beauty lying on the mattress in half. Lepidos and his charming beauty Zoilos, joyfully trudging to the ore deposit, having escaped punishment, and the slave Cesar, who considered death better than life. They did not yet know that this day would be short, and their last. The chief treasurer of the state of Atlantis, Zenon, lay on a lounge chair in the back room of his office and reflected. Zenon was troubled by the knowledge that he was considered a second-rate figure in Atlantis, nor was he particularly wealthy. Zenon suffered from an inferiority complex, which was caused not only by his modestly influential job as state treasurer or his lack of riches. He was haunted by the knowledge that, by origin, he was not a pure Atlantean. Zenon's mother was a slave and his father an Atlantean. Although it was forbidden in Atlantis to discriminate or show a dismissive attitude toward those born of such unions, such descendants were still treated with hidden contempt. Zenon's dream was to reach a financial position where, with his wealth, he could look down on everyone. His greatest desire was to open his own personal bank, the largest of all banks in Atlantis and its colonies. To start banking, however, required vast sums of money, which he could not have collected as the head of the state bank, even in a lifetime. At the same time, the desire to break through the routine of civil service into big business gnawed at him ever more strongly, into a society where a person was measured by the thickness of their wallet and where origin faded into the background. Zenon's dream was to become a commander of finances, a person to whom respect is shown and to whom humble requests for help are addressed. It would then be in his power to grant those requests or reject them, to show mercy or superiority. Zenon took a sip from his wine goblet, placed it back on the small table next to the lounge chair, and drifted back into his dreams. A future sketched itself before his eyes. He saw himself as a wealthy, respected figure, before whom members of parliament and government bowed respectfully, and whose participation in the cake parties of high society was considered a great honor, raising the self-esteem of those present. "Look, Zenon is here, and so am I." Zenon lay with half-closed eyes, completely occupied by visions of the future. The room was cool and dim, thick curtains almost completely obscuring the sunlight. Zenon was as if outside time and space. He did not know whether the sun was still in the morning hours or had reached midday. For him, the present moment was no longer important. He lived in the future, which differed so greatly from his routine official life. Zenon opened his eyes. With a sharp movement, he reached for the table and rang a bell. He needed the advice of a pragmatic. Pushing aside the curtain covering the doorway, the jurist, Lucius, entered. His bulging, round owl eyes tried to adjust to the dimness of the room. His gaze landed first on the wineskin next to the table, and traveled from there to Zenon's large belly, which seemed to signal to him, "I am the personality here." Lucius avoided looking people in the eye. As a pragmatic, he knew that deceivers cannot stand it. It makes them feel uncomfortable. In his work, he dealt only with such people, and he thought no better of Zenon. His gaze did not go unnoticed by Zenon, and it only increased the treasurer's determination. The belly turned toward Lucius. "Lucius, I want to consult you, but this must remain strictly confidential." Lucius blinked his owl eyes at the belly but said nothing, waiting for more. "I'm talking about business. Money must make money. In the state bank there are tens of millions of silver shekels sitting as an untouched reserve, not moved for years. Stagnant money is not money. Its value lies in its circulation." Having uttered these wise preparatory words, Zenon reached out with his short, fat fingers to grasp the wine goblet and took a gulp. Lucius's gaze traveled with the goblet to Zenon's lips and then back to the table. He began to understand exactly where the old rogue was heading. The reserves had to be put into play. But he still didn't say a word. It wasn't yet clear to Lucius in whose interest these silver shekels, this untouched reserve, were being targeted. Zenon continued, "The money should be lent out to earn interest, and not here in Atlantis, but somewhere further away, in the colonies." Saying this, Zenon sat up on his lounge chair, his belly resting comfortably against the wineskin. "You, Lucius, must prepare the matter. Draft a contract so that from a formal legal standpoint, everything is airtight and beyond reproach. Jock. Naturally, a share of the proceeds belongs to you, say 10 or 20%. Lucius coughed modestly, expressing his approval. The belly rose from the wineskin and fell back. Zenon took another sip and continued. "I'd like to know, what are the risks involved in this transaction?" This time, Lucius could not limit himself to a cough. He had to move into pragmatic explanations. "The risk is that lent money has a habit of not returning. When taking a loan and when repaying a loan, the borrower is in two entirely different psychological states. Likewise, these are legally distinct procedures that are almost impossible to bind together securely. The magnitude of the risk stems from the weakness or strength of that binding. If, when lending, one considers all circumstances, examining the borrower's background, their solvency, their character, setting a pledge, a mortgage, or obtaining a guarantee from another acceptable person, then the risk can be considered minimal. If, however, one ignores the aforementioned, disregarding all precautions associated with lending, then the risk is maximal, and it is more than certain that the money will not return. This is what we call a bad loan portfolio." Having said this, Lucius fell silent, watching the belly intently, which had pushed the wineskin into a dangerously tilted position. Zenon drained his goblet again. A plan began to take shape in his mind. The clever pragmatic had given him advice without saying it directly. Give a loan, earn interest, and get the loan back. The state of Atlantis gets the interest. But what does he, Zenon, get? He could find, so to speak, his own borrower, to whom he would lend at a lower interest rate in exchange for a hefty bribe. One can live well on bribes, but Zenon had other goals. Living well was not enough. A bad loan portfolio? Bad for whom? The state doesn't get its money back. The state is not Xenon, but Xenon could be more than the state. A bad loan portfolio for the state could be turned into a good and very profitable loan portfolio for him, Xenon. If he gave the loan, say at 5%, to his good friend, the banker Crassius, especially since Crassius never showed his face in Atlantis and churned money in the distant colonies, Crassius could be given the right to sublend. The money should move and vanish without a trace, eventually finding a secure haven in Xenon's account at a bank where secrets are kept. The state, meanwhile, could receive its little percentages for a while, until the money disappeared entirely. Xenon finished his ruminations. The belly left the wineskin alone and turned to the pragmatic. Lucius, but what dangers lurk for me in the case of a bad loan portfolio? Surely not prison. Lucius coughed again, and it remained unclear to Xenon whether this cough meant yes or no. Fortunately, the pragmatic opened his mouth wider. A bad loan portfolio can arise under several circumstances. If a loan remains unpaid due to circumstances the lender could not and should not have foreseen, that is, unforeseen, force majeure circumstances, which include earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or floods, then the lender is absolved of responsibility. If, however, the bad loan arose due to circumstances the lender could and should have foreseen, then we're dealing with professional negligence. In the state of Atlantis, official negligence is practically never punished, especially since proving the negligence of a high-ranking official is not easy. The blame can always be shifted onto subordinates. The court speakers, the advocates, know how to wash the guilty party clean in such a case. Besides, the Atlantean judicial system is quite rotten. If, however, the bad loan was issued with the direct intent of not getting it back for the purpose of diverting money into someone's personal pocket, then, that is theft. But proving theft is almost impossible. It's unlikely the matter would even reach a court, and even then, through the mutual collusion of officials, it is possible to make the theft non-existent. The pragmatic's mouth snapped shut. It seemed nothing more would come out of it. Xenon expected no more. The advice given in the form of a legal explanation satisfied him completely. Direct intent to steal money cannot be proven. There was little hope in justifying a bad loan portfolio by pointing to events he could not and should not have foreseen, or, as the owl-eyed pragmatic pedantically put it, force majeure circumstances. Only priests preached about floods and the last day. Bankers did not believe in such things. That left only the third option. A bad loan portfolio due to circumstances he could and should have foreseen. Professional negligence, for which one is not punished in Atlantis. Xenon ordered Lucius to prepare the loan agreement and to transfer the sum, 10 million silver shekels, to his banker friend Crassius's bank this very day. Becoming visibly more alert and cheerful, and not just from the wine, Xenon placed a second goblet next to his on the table and filled both to the brim. He thanked the pragmatic for the good advice, wished him success and a long life, and proposed a toast to their undertaking. Lucius and Xenon reached for the wine goblets in unison. At that moment, the goblets on the table began to clatter, wine splashed over the rims, and the hands of the bank officials froze in terror. The crustal shift was making itself known. Force majeure had manifested. The slave assistant pastor, Lucifer, in a long black robe with a white collar, was delivering a late-night sermon to the slaves from the pulpit. He had worked himself into a fever pitch. His round, fleshy face was flushed and dripping with sweat. The wine he had consumed in abundance before climbing into the pulpit was also taking its effect. A special brand of wine, fortified with palm liquor, Parmatuhat, was prepared for Lucifer. Today, the slave servant Liberius had been particularly diligent, filling the large silver goblet with more palm liquor than wine. Liberius took pleasure in listening to Lucifer's sermons. For him, It replaced the theater he had lost upon being enslaved in Atlantis. Lucifer grew increasingly animated. With a solemn face that barely masked a smirk, he rebuked the slaves sitting in the parterre, calling on them to suppress the lusts of the flesh, demanding temperance, decrying their love of alcohol, their laziness, and their hypocrisy. Lucifer threatened the disobedient with hell, the flood, and the judgment of the last day. He promised the humble a paradise and eternal bliss in the company of angels. Many slaves were already there, as confirmed by the snoring and sleep-muddled yawns coming from the back rows. Speaking of angels, Lucifer was reminded of the brothel next to the church and the pleasures associated with it. He lost interest in the sermon. Moreover, his hangover was making itself felt. Lucifer tossed a few more words of instruction and threat under the wide vaults of the church, which bounced from wall to wall before grazing the heads of the slaves and falling to the floor. With a final prayer, Lucifer declared the sermon over, to the disappointment of Liberius, who had settled in to enjoy the performance. The slaves rose from their seats, muttering with dissatisfaction. Usually, the sermon was infinitely long, giving them a chance to continue their interrupted sleep. Lucifer stumbled down from the pulpit, slumped through the vestry door, took a deep swig of parmatahat and, feeling more spirited, exited the church, forgetting to take off his pastor's robe. He set his pace toward the brothel. Despite being a regular visitor and a great connoisseur of the services offered, Lucifer found today's beauty to be a true surprise and an extraordinary master of her craft. At times, he felt himself to be already in complete paradise, a paradise on earth, and wished it would last forever. But nothing is eternal. His hours were numbered. At dawn, his time was up, and an ox-bodied eunuch overseer dragged him by the collar out of the garden of paradise, away from the arms of the black-curled beauty, despite Lucifer's desperate resistance. Giving a few parting knees to the backside, the eunuch sent Lucifer into the street. With a dull gaze, Lucifer stared at the constellation of Aquarius hanging over the sunrise, marveling that tonight had been so short. His intoxication had faded. He felt so tired and weak. The beauty had taken his last bit of strength, leaving only a few shekels in his pocket. Recovering slightly, he set off, the mat in his vestry his only goal. On the way, there was a temptation to step into a tavern, but Lucifer waved it off wearily. Enough for today, after all. It's not the last day. Exhausted, he slumped through the vestry door and lay down without undressing on the coarse rug where he usually napped between sermons. Despite his fatigue, sleep would not come. Lucifer felt like a pathetic failure who could never manage to get ahead in life, at least not to the honorable office of senior slave priest, or to some wealthier congregation, but the better positions were always snatched up by his fellow brothers in office. Just recently, when Atlantis was hit by another wave of religious fervor, money was collected, donations made, funds established for building new churches. He envied those who managed to get to the head of those funds. To have any fund under your backside is very profitable. You can always grab a handful for yourself, skim it off, lend it to friends, and churn the money. A fund is actually personality-less money, the use of which depends on the whims of the fund's insiders. The donors have not the slightest chance to control it. Lucifer sighed heavily. There seemed to be no end to the bad memories. It was like yesterday when he hung his pastor's robe on the peg and donned the white toga of a distillery owner. It suited him so well. In it, he looked like Jesus Christ in the vineyard. The liquor flowed like a river, promising him mountains of gold, especially since he didn't even have to produce it. Liquor confiscated from slave bootleggers and moonshiners, which was often mere swill, only had to be rebottled and put back into circulation. The high mortality rate of slaves from the toxic rot gut didn't worry him. Slaves weren't counted in Atlantis. No one knew their number. Lucifer took pleasure in gathering the slave bottlers for a sermon once a week on Sundays in the large circular auditorium on the distillery's vast grounds. There he had ordered a giant pulpit to be built, which towered over the mass of sinful slaves, instilling awe and raising Lucifer's personality to heavenly heights. On Sunday, the distillery owner Lucifer, dressed in a white toga, climbed into the pulpit, threw the edge of the toga over his fleshy neck, and began the sermon. He asked the Almighty for forgiveness for the slave bottlers in their sinful work, unlike the management of liquor production, which was surely an activity pleasing to the Almighty. The slaves were engaged in labor that was a direct sin. By pouring liquor, often confiscated swill, into skins for consumption by similar slave sinners, they were committing direct blasphemy. Lucifer asked for forgiveness for the slaves, emphasizing, "By letting your hands work quickly and showing no laziness or idling in your labor, you will surely receive the Almighty's redemption." To conclude his sermon, being sure the slave bottlers were aware of his adventures in brothels, Lucifer did not forget to add, "You must not walk according to my deeds, but according to my words." Unfortunately, Lucifer's status as the pastor of the vineyard was short-lived. Pharisees coveted his white toga and the accompanying benefits, and demoted Lucifer back to his former poor congregation as an assistant slave pastor. Lucifer sighed, closed his eyes, and tried to sleep. Suddenly it felt to him as if the ox-bodied eunuch had grabbed him by the collar again and was nudging him with a knee to the backside, trying to pull him off the rug. The walls began to sway. The church bells began to toll. Lucifer barely managed to make the sign of the cross, and that remained the last sensible movement of his earthly life. The slave Prime Minister Marcus sat in his office in a high armchair that mimicked the throne of the Titan Atlas. He was self-satisfied. In fact, he was in a state of constant happiness. Psychiatrists give such a state the diagnosis of happy idiot. Marcus could indeed be happy. Yesterday he, the Prime Minister of the Slave Society, had been visited by the High Advisor of Slave Affairs from the Atlantean Society, Stilius. The meeting took place in a warm, friendly atmosphere, as such meetings are customarily called. At times it seemed to Marcus as if they were talking as equals. Par in parem non habet potestatem. An equal has no power over an equal. Stilius joked, praised Marcus's wisdom in governing the slave society, and tried in every way to lead the slave prime minister into an easy conversation. He had reason for this. Lately, the slaves had begun busily establishing their own little plots of land where they grew various fruits, vegetables, and potatoes. They kept domestic animals. Getting their food from their own slave society households, the slaves bought very little of the Atlanteans' production. Or, as Stilius expressed it with Atlantean education, with the growth of the slaves' consumption of their own products, the import of Atlantean products into the slave society has significantly decreased. Several Atlantean export articles have fallen away: vegetables, meat, milk, bread, as well as the sackcloth for the slaves' tunics. The licenses and quotas for the slaves' own production had to be significantly reduced, while the regulations governing production, the Atlanto standards, had to be strengthened. And in general, the slaves have begun to forget who they are. For millennia, slaves produced nothing for themselves, always worked for the Atlanteans and built their wealth. And now, suddenly, Stilius caught himself. He had become too heated. Now was not the right time to put the slave in his place. Marcus was one of their boys, after all. He had ordered every tree growing in front of the slaves' huts to be cut down and replaced them with Atlantean sackcloth. Why do slaves need trees? Especially since some had already planted a whole forest, nearly a dozen trees, around their huts. Where has it been seen before that the slaves of Atlantis have property? And here already, forests, real estate. It's good that the matter was settled. Now again, domestic animals, cabbage, potatoes. They make moonshine from the potatoes and drink instead of working for the Atlanteans. Atlanteans need cheap hands. Too many, unnaturally many, have already reached the second or third rank in the slave society. It cannot continue like this. Soon the slaves will have created their own stable middle class, and then try keeping them in check. The main mass of slaves must consist of the lowest rank, lower than a beast of burden. Stilius forced himself to be restrained and continued the casual conversation. He promised to support Marcus in the slave society presidential elections. This came as a true surprise to Marcus, although deep down he had dreamed of the presidential chair. Then he would be almost like a real Atlantean. At least, etiquette and protocol would not allow anyone to show disrespect toward him, not even the Atlanteans, whatever they might think of him in their hearts. Marcus's round face stretched into a slavish smile. He thanked Stilius for the trust and promised to do everything in his power to ensure that in the slave society, the plots would be cleared of chickens, goats, cabbage, and potatoes. After Stilius left, Marcus walked excitedly back and forth in his office. He could not calm down. He, Marcus, would become president. Only now did he realize how strongly that desire had sat within him. Finally calmed, Marcus sat back in his armchair, the throne of the Titan Atlas, as he occasionally called his seat. When he became president, he would have a real gilded throne of Atlas built for himself. Marcus chuckled with delight. But then a wrinkle of worry crossed his brow. The happy smile vanished. This last fact testified that he did not, after all, fall under the diagnosis of happy idiot. He was worried about the resistance that would arise from the slave goat keepers and cabbage and potato growers if he announced a campaign to liquidate their households. Marcus decided to increase the slave law enforcement bodies. For this, however, it was necessary to buy additional weapons. The purchase of weapons could only be done from the Atlanteans. Marcus summoned the slave advisor Brutus. Brutus was given the task of investigating the possibilities of buying weapons. Immediately, Brutus galloped off to fulfill the task, seeking arms brokers. Hours passed. Brutus did not return. Marcus was already becoming impatient. Finally, the door burst open and the advisor stepped in panting, accompanied by the arms peddler Cassius. The broker took a seat without waiting for a signal, having weighed for a moment whether to sit in Marcus's armchair from which the latter had risen to greet the peddler. His choice fell on the closer armchair, where Stilius had sat a while ago. Cassius got straight to the point. He knew a weapons master who had weapons for sale in large quantities. Cassius praised the excellent qualities of the weapons and their low price. After a short, formal bargaining session, they shook hands. The deal was done. The broker Cassius exited, considering the slave prime minister worthy of even a parting nod. Hardly had Cassius left when Caius rushed in, also an arms dealer and broker. He was known for his particularly slippery tongue and the skill of selling even pans and other junk as weapons. Caius began to convince Marcus to buy weapons from a weapons master he knew, who would sell them for half the price. He pulled a chair closer, breathed the smell of garlic into Marcus's nose, and continued almost in a whisper. "We buy the weapons for half the price, but at the same price." Marcus blinked uncomprehendingly. Caius clarified, "Buying the weapons for half the price, we divide the saved sum between us in half." It began to clear in Marcus's slave head. Caius continued, "But we tell your slave society treasurer that we paid the full price, the same one Cassius offered." Look at the devil. He already knows Cassius's offer, Marcus thought indignantly. At the same time, Caius's proposal was extremely tempting. After much deliberation and going over precautions, they shook hands. Marcus woke back into the present day. Yes, yesterday was a happy day, and Marcus had reason to hope that today would be even better. Caius was supposed to appear any minute with the money, though it wasn't even midday yet. Steps were heard outside the door. Marcus jumped from his armchair to open the door and collided with Stilius. The high advisor of slave affairs pushed Marcus aside, stepped into the office, and flopped down. His face was flushed. The veins on his red neck threatened to burst. Stilius opened his mouth, but too many words had gathered there, and they all crowded out at once, making Stilius gasp and cough.
"Marcus, you slave! You cheated your master!"
Stilius finally got the words out. "My friend Cassius was already on his way with a load of weapons when he found out about the deal with Caius. Is this how you earn my trust?" Marcus's face turned pale with fright. His hands began to shake as if he had been struck by a violent fever.
High Advisor Stilius continued,
"This very day we will make you a slave of the lowest rank, and that is how you will die." Marcus began to tremble all over, as if the ground beneath him had been struck by an earthquake. Finally, he collected himself. At first he gaped, as if the words were stuck in his throat, and made a sound. "I will pay. I will give all the money I received to you, Master Stilius, and half as much again." He looked imploringly into Stilius's eyes, like a dog that has made a mess looking at its master. Stilius's redness began to recede, his face cleared, and he smiled reconciliatingly. "All right, Marcus, I forgive you. But you cannot remain Prime Minister of the slaves. The matter might get out. Cassius won't let it rest. I offer a solution. We will declare you dead. We will have a grand funeral with honors. The whole slave state will mourn. Instruments will play. You can even watch your own funeral yourself. We will put you in makeup so no one recognizes you. Later, we'll find a little spot for you on a distant island of Atlantis. We'll give the island to you as your property along with thousands of slaves. Beautiful slave girls." Marcus sighed with relief. It was a better solution than the lowest slave rank, after all. Plus, a grand funeral. Not everyone is given the chance to be present at their own funeral. Caius entered, 2 heavy bags of silver shekels over his shoulder. He grew embarrassed and shifted from foot to foot, not knowing how to act in Stilius's presence. Marcus pointed toward Stilius, ordering the money bags to be handed over to the High Advisor. The latter grabbed the bags and hoisted them onto his shoulder. Suddenly he began to sway, as if staggering under the weight of the bags. Marcus's large armchair, resembling the throne of the Titan Atlas, overturned, burying Marcus and Caius beneath it. At the same moment, the government temple of Slave Prime Minister Marcus collapsed entirely. Marcus knew how to account for everything and escape from every situation with his skin intact. But he did not know there are not 2 deaths, and one you cannot escape. The Atlantean writer Claudius sat in the basement of the library in his small cubicle at his writing desk and strained his brain. The basement was a bit damp, but pleasantly cool. He had been sitting at the desk all morning, but only a few disconnected lines had made it onto the paper. It just wouldn't progress. Claudius had decided to write a thrilling story about earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods. In a word, the end of the world, the apocalypse, about which Atlantean legends and mythological beliefs told so much. Various formulations swirled in his head, but the words would not settle on the paper. He was a great word weaver in philosophical musings. He knew how to put together long poems about love, but he could not imagine the apocalypse, much less describe it. Can it be described like a woman? Like love? His gaze fell on the high breasts of the slave girl lying next to the desk. Yes, those he knew. He knew their power and authority. He could touch them, stroke them, write blood-curdling poems and stories. But the apocalypse? Claudius rose, as if he intended to seek inspiration from the little slave girl apocalypse lying on the mattress, when suddenly the floor vibrated beneath him. A thick cloud of dust burst into the room. Claudius grabbed the slave girl in his arms and rushed toward the exit. The library filled with screams and cries for help. People wandered back and forth in confusion, unable to find an exit in the labyrinth of stairs of the giant temple. Someone fell on him, pushing the slave girl from his arms down the stairs. Claudius rushed headlong, finally reaching the exit. Church bells were ringing. The ground undulated and bubbled like boiling liquid. Houses collapsed like toy blocks, shrouded in thick dust that had already covered the sky and forced one to cough. From beneath the ground came a rumbling. It grew and was stronger than any tropical thunder ever experienced. Mothers could be seen running around in distraction, holding the corpses of their children in their arms. Those trapped under the ruins called loudly for help, but their cries were drowned out in the horrific roar. Claudius fled out of the city to the seashore, but froze in horror. A tidal wave nearly 100 meters high was approaching from the ocean. A moment later, Claudius was buried in the water. His unwritten story about the apocalypse had come true. Another great flood had occurred. The continent of Atlantis moved from its place and was then completely buried in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the Peruvian Andes, Lake Titicaca rose over its shores and rushed over the capital of Contichi, Viracocha, sweeping away everything living and burying the city in ruins, then falling back several kilometers below. Only the strongest buildings remained, signaling past times to subsequent civilizations. The Egyptian pyramids were washed by strong water flows. The flood covered most of the ground, leaving only the higher mountain areas untouched. The Earth's poles relocated to regions near the equator. The continents of low latitudes shifted to higher latitudes, to the poles and polar regions. The flora and fauna that ended up in these areas, having remained untouched by volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and floods, perished, freezing rapidly into the forming perpetual ice, permafrost, and snow. Only some plant and animal species survived in the polar regions, adapted to the new conditions, and achieved a permanent existence. Most birds that escaped the cataclysm headed south to warm lands, but, driven by homing instinct, they return to the northern lands to nest when the weather warms, only to head out again on the catastrophe route when the cold arrives, fleeing in flocks, just as happened tens of thousands of years ago during the Great Catastrophe. Even now, people in the northern lands watch the departing bird flocks in autumn with sadness and some unexplainable anxiety, as if the annual departure of the birds reminds them of the horrors of long ago. In spring, when the birds return to their true home in the north, which, before the cataclysm, was located in warm latitudes, people are again overcome with joyful excitement and hope for better times. The people who ended up at the poles, along with the crustal shift, perished. All living nature there perished. Of the people carried to the polar regions, the strongest survived the disaster. Some of them adapted to the new conditions, while others undertook long journeys south along with the animal herds heading south, fighting heavy battles along the way with other peoples whose lands the refugees entered. The African continent was torn away from Europe. A giant rift was formed, which, filling with water, formed the Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea all the way to the Indian Ocean. Slowly the floodwaters receded, and our faithful guard dog, the Sphinx, stood watch once more, and the pyramids were ready to reveal their secrets to the next generations. Most of Earth's humanity had perished. Those who survived kept the memories of the Great Flood, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions forever, and passed them down as legends. In addition to the catastrophe, the legends described long past times when gods descended to earth and built mighty temples and pyramids, established roads and reservoirs, taught literacy, healed the sick, performed miracles, and wished for people to be their obedient servants, whose task was to live by the gods' words of instruction. It is difficult to distinguish whether these legends are based on events from the first crustal shift or the second, which preceded the current civilization, and descriptions of which are found in humanity's Book of Wisdom, the Bible. The second civilization, and with it the state of Atlantis, was destroyed. Their message, their ideas were scattered across the world, But messages and ideas do not perish. They are picked up by descendants, and again, some people will start to consider themselves a chosen people who have the right to set out to rule the world, not knowing all the while that they will inevitably end as tragically as the people of Atlantis. Their state was destroyed, and only those who were in other parts of the world less ravaged by the horrific cataclysm escaped. The people of Atlantis remained scattered across the world. For millennia, they still tried to act as a chosen people, and anyone who did not recognize this was their enemy. They still tried to achieve financial supremacy through financial and bank fraud, considering themselves smarter than others. But such activity no longer expressed wisdom, but rather insolence and the mutual collusion of their own kind. Over time, other nations also acquired wisdom, and the Atlanteans' influence faded.
Humanity on Earth has survived severe trials. Their civilizations have emerged and perished, and no one knows when the next cataclysm will occur, or how horrific it will be. Humanity on Earth does not know whether the catastrophe will be caused by a crustal shift, Earth's meeting with a comet, or whether large meteorites or asteroids falling to Earth will prove fatal, which are especially dangerous if they hit atomic power plants or energy systems on Earth. Although we, the scientists of Umaran, are constantly in a near-Earth orbit and protect the Earth from comets, meteorites, and asteroids, we cannot do this forever. The people of Earth must look after their own safety themselves, but no world ruler can ensure it, for he rules without the support of the people, of humanity. Nations that have been humiliated by their own rulers or foreign conquerors are subjects with a shattered psyche. The way to a higher, second-dimension civilization is closed both to such subjects and their rulers. Only a second-dimension civilization is capable of anticipating and preventing cataclysms. A person, upon reaching the second dimension, is mentally capable of receiving the secrets of the birth of the universe. The meaning of life is opened before them. Modern humanity on Earth is not yet ready for this. If humanity on Earth did not pay so much attention to its comfort, were less occupied with activities directed toward pleasure, trivial entertainment, and greed for money, they would see many signs pointing to their future. A person on Earth should not look to the constellations of the zodiac for trivial answers, but find the answer to the main question, for whom the bell tolls. For as the well-known writer of Earth's current civilization, Ernest Hemingway, said, "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." The story of the space traveler, UFO Umaran, recorded in Luta Village, Voru County, in the year of our Lord, 1999. Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.